And that intense cross-examination is still happening right now. We expect that it's going to last for quite some time. Of course, no cameras allowed in the courtroom, but here's the latest court sketch that just came out, which of course shows NCIS lead investigator Joe Warpinski being questioned by Edward Gallagher's attorney, Mark Mukasey. So one of the things that they are harping on during this cross-examination is that there was no forensic or scientific or physical proof that this alleged stabbing of the ISIS fighter, the teen ISIS fighter, even occurred. I mean, at one point, they even threw out this statement, is there even proof that the prisoner is even dead? And the lead investigator said, quote, well, no autopsy or anything like that. There were also some questions and some answers along the lines of being confirmed that there were no walkthroughs conducted by NCIS agents in a timely manner after the alleged stabbing occurred of the compound in which this stabbing might have occurred. No medical examiner or no photos even taken by crime scene investigators. That a lot of this that a lot of this case was built off of witness testimony. Once that shifted the conversation to witness testimony, that's when the defense started to hone in on what they believe is a flawed methodology of interviewing a lot of these SEAL team members that were treated as witnesses in this criminal case, basically pointing out that they were all told that they did nothing wrong, or at least, the first witness was told right off the bat that they did nothing wrong and that they felt that they had a slam dunk case. This was about 24 to 48 hours after they received the case. So this cross-examination, it is a pretty key moment in this case, because this is, again, the key NCIS investigator that built up a lot of the evidence that the prosecution is using against Navy SEAL Chief Edward Gallagher. And right now, the defense is trying to poke holes in that investigation. We expect that this cross-examination will last for quite some time. We were told that that the prosecution was supposed to wrap up today and that the defense would take over, but it's not clear if that will happen.